I know you've prepared a presentation. This could
Yeah,
be
I had
one of
some
the
slides
things.
just to guide us a little bit through some of the things I've been
Yeah.
doing and a little bit the journey I've seen a bit. I didn't start as a journalist actually, and one of the first things I wanted to show is Keanu Reeves. Not so much because some people compared me to him when I was young, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was. I had actually long hair. Like,
Did you start as, because you said I didn't start as a journalist?
I didn't start as a journalist. I started as a filmmaker.
Uh-huh.
And right around the time that I was in the film school, the Matrix was really hot. And it reminded me because I think the new one will come out very soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it touches so much that one of the key questions that we're now facing about what's reality and can we trust our own experiences, and is everything that we experience real, or is it part of a kind of uh, digital simulation that we're experiencing very close to the metaverse that we're now.
Yeah.
And I thought like, oh, I've seen this before, like when I started studying film. And I know it was a major starting point for myself because I wanted to recreate this kind of Matrix experience, but then in reality. So one of my first works, and this is Look at Me Standing Here, was my final work as a cinematographer.
Uh-huh.
It was a very small piece of footage that I filmed somewhere in the south of France. You see a couple they're kind of meeting, waiting. They had a discussion. They're lingering, but the actual footage was very short, and I edited until 12 minutes as if it was a super long, dramatic conversation. So the whole movie was manipulated. It was I cut out those two characters and moved them independently. So they had a completely new fictional relationship. And at that time, it was quite a new kind of thing to do. But it was triggered by this matrix experience. Like everything that you see can be actually manipulated. It's your starting point as a journalist that you manipulate reality.
And you didn't have the editing programs as well that you have nowadays. So it probably
No, this
in
was
2001, it was difficult.
frame by frame. Frame by frame rotoscope. So you could rotoscope, cut out the whole figure, and then if you had a clean background, you could then they could move independently. And then I used some morphing software to morph them from one position to another position, and it became a bizarre. But it was very early stage. I think nowadays you can do these kind of things very easily.
Do you have it somewhere? Is it up online somewhere?
Yeah, it's still online. It was archived. I won a few competitions. It was archived by the Dutch Film Institute, I think, so somewhere online.
Okay, might have to look that up.
Viewers would like to go on a research hunt, maybe.
Yeah.
Talking about research, that was actually the thing that then, because I ended up as an experimental filmmaker, and I can tell you there's not a lot of jobs for experimental filmmakers. So I did an extra year of journalism, and from there, because I was already working with reality and was fascinated with things in reality, I ended up as a researcher for investigative documentaries. And one of the things that helped me most at that stage was this excellent course from Daniel Russell. I don't think it's available anymore, or not for free. I think you can still find it if you pay for it, because he's retired. But at that time, he was the head of Google Search, and he was the master of search techniques. You could really learn so much from the advanced power search. And I really still think that journalists could get so much more out of Google than that they currently know. So that was one of the things that I thought worth sharing.
Two ex-teaching fellows are saying yes.
Yeah.
You can definitely get more out of search if you know.
And if you're lucky, you could still find this somewhere online. I think that the original course is gone, but it's still certainly somewhere available.
No.
This is one of the things that I came out of that kind of working as a researcher, is that the combination of being a cinematographer and somebody who did storyboards, I started combining my research as visual research rather than just writing things down. It was mapping things with pictures and graphs, and that helped me a lot to pre-visualize a story, to see links between different parts of the story. I don't know what this tool is again, but it's one of the mapping tools that are out there.
So, and why does it help you to map this out visually?
I think because again, I'm a visual person, and I start seeing the connections. You see the connections in the story. It also generates new angles because you could see, okay, which of the things that they already cover, maybe there's another angle that I can explore. So by having it all in one view, this kind of visual mapping gives you, yeah, I don't know, a different way to build stories.
Is that something you tell, maybe, I don't know if you tell journalists anything, but if you tell them that this works for me, maybe, because if we talk about, say, multi-channel storytelling or something like that, then what you see more often is journalists using post-its and literally rearranging maybe, I don't know, scenes or paragraphs or data visualizations.
Explore things in different ways, start with outlines, make things visual. And what I see is that, because this is actually an online tool, but it
Yep.
works even better if you can do it live. I experience it a lot in this hybrid new environment. We're using a lot of these Miros and murals and these kind of tools, but somehow it still works. If the bigger the canvas, when I used to work at VRT and we could relocate the kind of innovation lab that we had, I explicitly asked, can you make at least one wall, one part of the room completely whiteboards? So from the floor to the ceiling, so that we have one wall that's only whiteboards, so that we can put things there, leave things there, drafts, things in a huge.
Definitely.
Anyway,
Great. Yeah.
so this was more I evolved from being a researcher to a journalist, and then an editor in chief. And during that period, I would say, this is already 2009, but I started 2003, 2004, 5, 6, 7. That was actually also the period when social media started to become more.
Yeah.
So suddenly you had to rethink like that whole publication value chain.
Yeah.
What's the role of these new kind of these new kind of channels in that? Where do we promote? Where do we publish? What kind of forms do we need? And that's still something I feel is very much a question that's happening in every newsroom. Currently, I would say every newsroom is wondering, what should we do in TikTok, and should we have a specific format for that, and how will we ever get revenue from being on TikTok, or how can we have a relationship with those audiences? How will they ever find what we do somewhere else? So we're still in that same kind of mechanism somehow.
Definitely. Maybe a short uh, something that Anna Maria said earlier on concerning the whiteboards. She says, I would love it if a journalist came with a storyboard instead of 1,500 words on paper. I think we can all agree that this would be a great idea, right?
Yeah, I would love it, but it's not necessarily easy for journalists who have not been trained in that kind of thinking. And I think I need some time at the VRT. When I was kind of head of the innovation labs there, we wanted to introduce, or there was a big request to have a more visual way of telling stories on the web, like this, because the New York Times and this whole scrolling was happening at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like those.
So we also wanted to invent something like this.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, let's start with making kind of visual blocks in PowerPoint. Just make blocks. Like, the easiest one was a full picture with a title on. And then we have two halves. And then we have combined views. And we made a kit like this with maybe 20 combined story blocks, and started to hand this out in the newsroom to see, okay, now if you would make that story that you've written like this, how would you do it with these story blocks? It was extremely difficult for people to master that, to go from something written to that kind of thinking.
Yeah, because you mentioned that they might not be trained like that, and I know from certain journalism schools in the Netherlands, those are the ones I know, two of them, that they've been very highly educated in design thinking and using post-its and maps and canvases and whatever, and that they have to come up with creative ways of, and that their assignments, that you are not allowed to write any text, right? That could be an assignment. So they train those journalists. So would that problem be solved with the new generations, you think, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think the current generation is much more visual. I was saying it yesterday to my wife. I see some of my daughter's friends who are 10, 11 years old do cinematographic cuts on TikTok with like wipes and cutaways and things like this, which took me years to kind of master.
Yeah.
They're now doing it out of the pocket with their phones and very clever kind of editing. So
Yeah.
we're completely in a different generation.
There are basically TikToks explaining how to do jump cuts, how to do transitions, etc.
Yeah.
in TikTok. So it's really interesting.
But then you said mastering the story chain, ID, research, report, publish, feedback, and feedback from the audience or from your professional co-workers in journalism or from
Either
all
from the
those?
audience, and I think that
Yeah.
was some of the thinking that started to seep in, is that social media was something that became another channel to retrieve stories, to get feedback early in the commissioning rather than at the end of a story. And I think that connects a little bit to the reason why I went at some stage. I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and went to the US because they just started a new course at the CUNY graduate school, and it was called entrepreneurial journalism.
Yeah.
It was Jeff Jarvis who started it there. I think Anita is now leading.
And
It wasn't initially. It was Jeff Jarvis who started it, and it completely intrigued me because it started from rethinking how you could bring journalism to your audiences, but also how you evaluate journalism. Like, and the startup scene of journalism startups in New York at that time was really interesting. There were a lot of things happening there. So I was very lucky that I could join one of the first cohorts of students and researchers that joined the program. And it infused this whole idea of business thinking, of the value that we create, of modeling, and also quickly having a kind of MVP startup idea for journalism.
And was it about the company, the organization of a new sort of journalism organization, or also as a journalist for coming up with stories or producing stories or pitching
This was
stories?
very much about finding new business models for journalism.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Understanding that certainly I think at that times the social media a new kind of it was at the moment where BuzzFeed was really big and starting to create like this new kind of business model for news, and there was a realization that they needed something different in order to survive in that kind of world. So a
Just
lot of new ideas came up.
and not just listicles, but also those they had the recipes, right? Which the New York Times is now very big on, I think, with recipes and
Yeah,
the Wirecutter.
there was
Yeah.
a boom of hyper local websites at that time.
Yeah.
Like, everything had to be
Yeah.
hyper local.
Yeah.
So all these new things were happening, and I was super fascinated. Unfortunately, when I came back in Europe, I was still working at VTM. I was a bit ahead of the curve, and people were wondering, "What are you trying to do? There's no money in the internet." And
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I was
our-
just wondering because it's so great that you're highlighting all these sort of things from the, not too distant past. But what do we learn from all these changes? Just, I don't want to be too philosophical here, but maybe you might have an answer
the
in
for me, it's
journalism.
also always about different lenses to look at journalism, and all of these for me are different lenses. I started with that lens of the cinematic lens and the storytelling,
Yeah.
and how that influenced me. Then you have the whole search and the kind of deep search that goes way into the privacy of people, and how that also influenced the kind of stories that were told. I
Yeah.
would say this whole social media landscape, and that the explosion of channels and ways to reach your audience, as well as the kind of audience that looks back and even generates content themselves. And then the realization that we had to rethink the way we operate and the rethink the way we our business models. And what followed afterwards, of course, was this is something else, but was the realization of new ways of approaching journalism itself, like as a product,
Yeah.
as a not anymore as just content, but as a product or as a service that you needed to deliver.
Yeah. But you say different lenses, like different perspectives, or is it a bit different still? Different lens to look through at your own profession in a way, or
For me, the a lens means that if you look at journalism as being pure content, it's a different lens than if you would say it's also a service, or it's also
yeah,
a product, or it's
yeah,
also and so you shift your perspective on how you create. If you say user first perspective, that's a different kind of thinking. If you would say that storytelling and even fiction could be a way to talk about reality, that again is a new perspective, and that's something
yeah,
I see now as well.
yeah. But I can imagine it's a principle to work with if you're talking about change in a newsroom or change in journalism, that you say it's just another lens. So say the metaverse or a podcast or TikTok. These are all maybe different lenses to look at journalism or
I use that lens because it helps sometimes people to see that what you're looking at is not necessarily changing. It's the way you look at it that's changing.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
And it also feels like a tool, like it's something
yeah,
you can manipulate and you can play with and you can alter, but it's not necessarily changing who you are. It's not necessarily changing what you want to talk about. It's changing just the approach and the way you talk about it or the way you approach it.
yeah,
And sometimes the product is very similar to another one, but it has like a different approach. I mean, if you have the example of radio features, for example, reporting on radio, which is not on demand, such as a podcast, for example, but still it is a very similar approach at the end of the day, a different type of distribution, for example, or availability, because it's not sent out once from the radio station and then it's gone for the day and maybe appearing the next day again. But a podcast is like available anytime. But still, the way you are approaching it is very close to a radio feature concerning podcasts and radio features. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the whole idea of linear versus non-linear, of
Yeah.
pull versus push, all these kind of things that changes the way you build a story, that might change the way people interact with it, the expectations that they have. And this is everything that you need to take into account, because one of the things that I've included here, so I've at some time when I was in CUNY, I was meeting and hearing new tools and new kind of startups every day, and it was just too much for me to keep up with, because I also learned to code there, and I did data visualization, and I did mobile storytelling, and there were so many new apps. So I started pinning them on Pinterest. So, and quickly I saw, oh, this is a nice way to actually collect them. So I made these kind of icons so I could group them, collections of tools.
yeah,
And then I started tweeting about them. And of course, because Jeff and a few other people were also there, it quickly became some kind of very popular account that a lot of journalists started to follow. And then I felt obliged to to start running it. But it became a really great stepping stone to a new career, because it opened doors to festivals, opened doors to new partnerships. I got funding to do a website for journalism tools. So there was a lot of new opportunities that actually happened through this very innocent collection of new tools that I was encountering at the school.
yeah. Cool. And
And
again, very visual. You used Pinterest to make sense and to
yeah, I need to.
yeah,
You will see
yeah,
as well, like this storytelling
interesting. Yeah,
canvas is because
yeah,
you talked about how does it influence the tool, how does it influence your story, and this was one way when I did lectures about the new tools. It's like, how do you select the tool, and I would like, what are some of the story elements that you have? What's the time that you have to create the story? What are your skills? Are you a beginner, or are you very skilled? Which platform do you work for? Is it the mobile? Is it the web? Would it be a watch? What kind of interaction do you expect? What's the price that you have in mind? So there were different elements and the kind of reaction that you wanted to have once you applied that tool. And I still think it's very relevant if you have new tools to consider these elements.
yeah.
To take the time for this. Yeah. Hmm.
Great.
I think I'm passing through my slides, and I'm arriving at the time where I stopped being pure journalist and became much more an innovation person and somebody looking at the organization. And at VRT started by, I took some of the learnings that I had in the States and started to think about user first working, creating personas for products that we had much more in design thinking. And we brought this design thinking as well in the newsroom floor. And that was a very new project, actually. It was these very simple test cards where we said, we believe that creating longer headlines will work better than shorter headlines. And we will test this by creating longer headlines for a few weeks. And then we will measure this by measuring the outcome of these articles for in this way. And we're right if we see a result X, if we see that there's an increase of our reach or whatever after so many weeks. And by making that very visual and having a wall with these experiments, the whole newsroom could follow what we were currently testing and doing. So it became a very low and easy exercise for the newsroom floor.
And
Great
everyone,
overview.
yeah, and you were
Yeah.
transparent as well because everyone could see what this team was doing, why they were doing it, and when it would
Yeah, that was
be
one of the
successful.
conditions
Yeah,
that I said, because the editor-in-chief asked, can you help? They wanted to consolidate it to 3 newsrooms, so the radio one, an online one, and
yep.
a TV one, and they had this big change project. And I said, do you want to facilitate this somehow? And said, just give me a space in the middle of the newsroom where I can bring in some of the people of your teams, different teams, and we'll do design sprints the whole time. And we'll take a big whiteboard and we'll announce what we're doing, and we show the results. And
Yeah.
after a while, people started knocking on our door and asked, can we try this once, or can you do something for us? And it became a very positive thing in the middle of the newsroom.
Yeah. And that's something you said you specifically wanted as a criteria to have it in the middle of the
Yeah.
newsroom. Yeah.
I wanted to have in the middle of the newsroom, and I also said I wanted to have a commitment from every editor-in-chief of at least, I think, one person from each unit. So one radio person, one online person, and one TV person. And on top of that, a few extra profiles, so that everybody was a little bit, there was some skin in the game. They couldn't just say, oh, we're not invested. This is something from innovation. They needed to be in it.
Yeah, to own
So,
it as well.
Yeah.
yeah, a bit of an obligation.
And which year was this again? I'm really, I feel like I'm like Nadine and I and our viewers are really sitting front seats in this sort of very
This
special
was 2015, I think.
15. So we got a couple of years to go until we arrive in the future, right?
Yeah. I think these are some of the formats that we started then introducing, which are now quite common. But at that time, like these very visual, small stories and infographics and videos were not so common yet. And we created the tools to automate this all. So everything was automated. Then 2017, I moved to the EBU, where things got on a different level, because it was not so much more innovation of newsrooms or in newsrooms, but how do we transform organizations? And it became at the organization level, a bit the level that I'm more at now. And I think the realization there, and that was a very nice one, was also, again, how do we look differently to public broadcasters and public companies than maybe commercial newsrooms? And again, having a different lens to look at transformation, where we might not be looking at revenue, but we want to generate impact, which is a different thing. We're not really working for consumers, but maybe more for audiences or people that are
Maybe, or
citizens. Yeah. So again, I use that image of the lens to look differently at transformation. We're citizens, and instead of business value, we need social value. Instead of the target markets, because a commercial company can just say, I just want those high earners. Public service media needs to be universal, and then impact instead of revenue. And I think I'm trying to bring some of that thinking now back to, again, a more commercial background, because I think it is relevant for commercial companies as well.
But it's also looking at this very interesting diagram or illustration. I would say that it seems like it's also a bit about the same conversation that people are having, especially in Europe, I would say, when it comes to regulating big tech or thinking about the future of AI, with all these these big lawsuits going on, but also about the values, and then talking in Europe about regulation and citizen social value, universality.
Yeah. So that's why I feel
It's like Europe versus the United States in a way, a bit.
European companies could very well be here in the public service media column.
Exactly,
And say,
yeah.
we really want to create social value. Actually, Mediahuis is very much about their core mission is about enabling journalism for society. That's really what they want to do. So that's in the core of their mission.
Yeah.
And then I'm actually at where I'm now shaping the future newsrooms at Mediahuis. So we talked already about that. I brought 2 projects. One of them which is a tool that I can highlight a bit.
Yeah. Article DNA, you say, right?
This is the article DNA. I can highlight it before the Rhetoric one. I just thought it's a current project that we're working on, especially our data people, but I'm helping them to bring this to the newsrooms. And it's about every article has a DNA, and it has a certain genre. It answers a certain user need. It has certain data inherent in it, has maybe a certain tonality. And if you start understanding that DNA and start understanding what readers want at some given point of day, you can commission in a different way. So you can use that DNA to improve your mix or to change your mix or to work in a more granular way with your content.
And this is all about metadata, you said earlier, right? Is it
Yeah,
also about
it's
automation with machine learning, or is it human?
it's partly automated, so by AI that really analyzes text and that would look at IPTC categories and tonality of text and could do a gender scan to see if if we're diverse enough in these articles. There's a part that's also handled by the newsroom, and that has more to do with what genre is this? Or is this something that appeals more to the heart or more to the heads? Is it more something that's for me or for the group? And these kind of, things that are hard for a machine now to currently, that's things that we place on top with the editorial.
Yeah. And if you develop something like article DNA, do you have some certain pilot titles, like maybe in Ireland or in Belgium in mind, or do you know that?
This is not something that we will roll this out in a very gradual way. We're currently testing this with some of our Belgian newsrooms. We're currently testing this with one newspaper in the Netherlands, and we will gradually experiment because it needs adoption. It's an extra step for some of these handlings in the newsroom. And again, we have to see how fluently, how much, because it's an ID, but we also need to see what's the value, the real value that we can get out of it down the road. But I'm very enthusiastic about it.
And we have a question again from Anne-Marie. Is it funded by GNI? Because it says
Article DNA is a really big project, and a part of it, a specific part of it called Content Mix, is partly funded by Google.
yes.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah. So
that was it.
Yeah.
This is the tool that I brought for today. It was Rhetoric. So that's the end of my presentation, actually.
Thank you for guiding us through all these years of change in journalism, for giving us this sort of bird's eye view and your personal experience with all those different eras, I would say, in journalism. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for your insights, Esther. Once
Yeah, and have a really good end of the year. I really hope everybody as well, if who's watching, take time for your family, enjoy it, because we don't know what's coming.
That's
True.
And with that, my dear viewers, we would like to welcome you back in the next year, and we'll let you know who will be our next guest. Thank you, Ezra. Thank you, Nadine. And thank you, viewers.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a great end of the year, everybody.